Hello, and welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. I almost said the road to 2000. How dare I? Today on Chess Openings Explained, I wanted to continue the fun in my F3 Nimzo series. Last week we kicked it off with what is the most common line that I face, and a line that is, I think, just objectively better for white. In fact, I was watching some coverage of the Speed Chess Championship going on over the past few days, and I saw some incredibly strong Grandmaster Jan Gustafsson say something similar about that structure just being good for white. So it's nice to get some validation watching these top level opening theoreticians sort of confirm what I'm trying to figure out on my own here. But today I wanted to continue with the move 4d5 by black, and this time we're going to take a look at a much tougher nut to crack by the players with the black pieces. They don't necessarily have to play into this structure. That does turn out to give white an advantage in most cases. So let's take a look at how that goes. I wanted to start off, as I did last time, this time just with one of my own games from the past year. I feel like starting off with these gives you a good idea of what it actually looks like when players like myself and players at the class level or maybe expert level are playing these positions with both colors. So let's see what line we're going to talk about today. We have d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, f3, and again, this move 4d5. And today I'm going to cover the second main option for black that you can go for after committing to this move d5 on move 4. White should still play a3, as we talked about in the last lecture. Captures, and then last lecture we spent some time talking about kingside castles here, as well as c5, but in both lines, after c takes d5, we looked at the slightly dubious, in my opinion, e takes d5, and then this is sort of a structure with this pawn either on f2 or f3, to be honest, that does tend to favor white, as we saw in some specific lines last week. Now, though, we are going to look at the much more testing knight takes d5. And of course, this is a move that you cannot play after castles, because here this knight is actually going to end up a little bit stuck. White has a very interesting tactic that goes e4, sacrificing the c3 pawn, and then after queen b3, this knight finds itself with no retreating squares. Queen takes d4, the only hope, but this runs into bishop b2, pinning this way. Queen e3 is an attempt to unpin, but after the important bishop e2, this knight again will find itself stuck. Knight d5 the only way to unpin, and then miraculously, king f2, knight c2, rook c1, and finally we have captured this knight. So interesting tactic to know here. Notably, in my experience, you don't have to memorize this entire line. Just remember that if your opponent castles, you can take on d5, and now they have to take e takes d5, because if they take knight takes d5, e4 wins the game. That's really all I keep stored up here in my small head. The rest you can sort of figure out over the board, and just understand that this knight should be trapped if you find the right moves. The only real trick is that after queen e3 check, you cannot play knight e2, because then in the main line here, this knight is going to trade itself off for the bishop on f1, and you'll find yourself with two fewer pawns than your opponent. So got to be careful there. What is all of this to say? The point is, today we are looking at the move 6c5 and knight takes d5. You cannot play knight takes d5 after castles for this reason. Now, of course, the key difference is that this line is nowhere close to working for white, because c takes d4 will cement this knight, and a huge advantage for black. So here, white is unable to play e4, but what can white do? Well, there's a slightly unintuitive move that sometimes shows up in all of these openings where black is playing in early c5, and that move is d takes c5. This is sort of the move that you'll see occur, I think, a lot at the amateur level, at the beginner level especially. You take one look at that pawn on c5 and you say, well, that pawn's not defended, why can't I take it? And this is one of the slightly rare occasions where it is actually correct to capture this pawn. Why isn't it normally correct? Well, normally black is able to recapture this pawn a little bit later, for example with the dark squared bishop or with the knights. But here, white can actually make it a little bit awkward for black to regain this material fully. Black's best move, and really the only, well, actually there's two moves here. But the best move, in my opinion, is queen a5, attacking the c3 pawn and the c5 pawn. What's the other move, you ask? Well, hold on a little bit. It's the move f5, which we will definitely get to. But first, the main line, queen a5. And here it looks like white's actually in a bit of a tough spot. But you can, in fact, just evict this knight now with e4 by capturing on c5, taking away this option for black. Now, once again, you can force this knight to move out of the way. Why not knight takes c3? Well, the move queen d2 is simply quite good for white. Why is this quite good for white? Well, if you think you're going to take this, bishop b2, and this knight is once again a little bit stuck. Bishop g7, for example, rook c8 is coming in short order, and black will have to resign this game. So, knight takes c3, not really playable. Queen takes c3 is a check, but then bishop d2, and keep an eye on these lines because they will start to look a little bit familiar when we talk about the f5 move. That is an occasion when this queen takes c3 move will be a bit more relevant. But here, once again, this is just going to be a very pleasant position for white. Bishop c3, and once again, there's trouble on the c file. If you think you're going to take the c5 pawn, there's trouble on the g7 square, and white is just much better here. So, enough talk of all these silly little sidelines. The point is e4. It looks as though that this pawn on c3 is hanging, but in this case, it's not that big of a deal. It's not really hanging. And here we're going to talk about two different moves. Knight e7 and knight f6 are the two main options for black, just both natural retreating knight moves. Knight c7 is kind of a move, but in my opinion, it just doesn't really make sense. You can play similarly to how you would play against knight e7 or knight f6. And the knight on c7, in my opinion, is just badly placed. So not really going to touch on that too much. But here, my opponent played the main move, knight e7. And now you can simply go bishop e3. And this is now just a sacrifice of the c3 pawn if your opponent wants to take it. Again, though, this is not going to be a pawn your opponent really should be taking. In this case, though, there's no direct refutation, as in the other cases with an early bishop c3 or anything. It's just that this pawn isn't really worth the time it takes to capture with the queen. This queen is going to have to leave a little bit later on. White can develop naturally, and now white's bishops will start to exert their pressure on the queen's side. With that in mind, knight d7 is the move that my opponent chose to play in the game, and it's not really the main move. So, I was officially out of theory at this point in time, so let's take this opportunity to get sort of a feeling for the position, right? This is, of course, a game I played over the board. My opponent was rated around 1950 at the time, and you know, you're out of theory in this position. Let's examine some of the ideas, right? So, white, for the moment, does have an extra pawn on c5, and the c3 pawn is still hanging. So the next move is, you know, pretty natural. You just go queen b3 and defend this pawn on c3. And white now has a really interesting idea if black thinks they can take this pawn just sort of outright. So what should white be doing if black thinks they can just capture this pawn on c5, regaining their material? What do you think, chat? Mayer says, cool chess shirt, how do you get one? You come to the St. Louis Chess Club and you buy it. These are for sale. Okay. Queen b5 check, not quite. White's really critical move here is actually the strange looking queen b4. You quite simply are forking black's pieces, right? It's not the most standard kind of fork that you would ever expect to find. But the point is, the only way out of this for black is to just capture on b4, but this is going to fix white's pawn structure. Either pawn capture is actually quite good for white here. In fact, this is probably just immediately winning another pawn back. So keep this queen b4 idea in mind. It often makes this threat of knight takes c5 a little bit of a paper tiger, whereas if you can get queen b4, and even if this tactic to win a pawn didn't exist, c takes b4, white would be doing very, very well here with the two open bishops, easy development, and a totally fixed pawn structure. So someone in the chat says this pawn structure is terrible, and for the moment that's true, but it's okay to have a terrible pawn structure when you have more pawns. That's kind of the gist of it. So my opponent goes knight c6, which is fine, and I continued with a4. Now my opponent, having stopped queen b4, decided that knight takes c5 was playable now, and he was correct. I go queen a3 though, using the space that was made by pushing this a pawn. Knight comes back to d7, and now after simple development, white is simply better in this position. Why is that? Well, let's take a look. My opponent goes queen d8. Why does my opponent go queen d8? Well, because this queen on a3 is surprisingly powerful, and black's king is simply stuck in the center. So over the board, at the class level play, it's not even move 15 yet, and once again, white has a strong advantage, as white often does in the f3 Nimzo if the opponent is unprepared. So now my opponent starts making some concessions to try to castle. I just continue developing the pieces out. Knight c6 fractures the pawn structure. Now queen d6 takes over the dark squares. And my opponent goes knight back to b8, and this is rather striking, My opponent had developed two pieces. They're both now dead, and the remaining pieces on their starting squares. And the game didn't last too much longer, I think. My opponent ran into some quick trouble here on the king's side and lost material and lost the game not too quickly, not too slowly after. Just checks, and we don't need to look at this. This isn't relevant to the lecture, just the poor guy. Rook takes h5, final move of the game, and that was the match. If you take this, check, check, check. Tough. Tough, tough, tough. So what happened this game? It looked like black just developed, white developed, black tried to regain this pawn, and then everything sort of went afoul for black after this move, knight d7. Black's king was stuck in the center, and white was quickly winning. And that's a story that can kind of go either way in this variation. On the surface level, it actually doesn't look too dangerous for either side, right? You know, you sort of develop out. White has this messy, messy, messy pawn structure, but the character of the game is basically white tries to make it so that recapturing this pawn is a bad idea for black, and black will be fully equal if he does manage to capture this pawn back on c5. So in this case, I succeeded in making knight takes c5 a bad move for black, and for that reason, when my opponent did play knight takes c5, he had a worse position in this case. So that's sort of the reason why I wanted to show you this game. The character of this line, in my opinion, is if black can take back on c5 with no problems, then black is doing totally, totally fine, and if white isn't careful, might be better. But if white can either maintain this pawn or get some other advantage after knight takes c5, then white is going to be a bit better. So let's see what that looks like on the theoretical level now. Now that we've seen what it looks like in an over-the-board game that I have played, let's see what it looks like at that top level, at the opening theory level, with players, coming very well prepared. And for that, I want to start off in the same line we just looked at, the knight e7 line, but with players of a bit higher strength. That is Chao and Jakovenko. So let's take a look at how these players did it. By the way, this game, I should scroll down, is from the Geneva Grand Prix in 2017. I know this helps Ben Simon a lot when I just say that out loud. So d4. By Chao, knight f6, and we get into our main variation here. Bishop b4, f3, d5, a3, takes, c5. Once again, c takes d5. E takes d5 would be the first lecture. We're talking about knight takes d5. And again, e4 allows knight takes now, so we go dc5. And once again, f5 is playable. We'll talk about that later, but the main move is queen a5. Now e4. Knight c3 means queen d2, queen c3 means bishop d2, so knight either to f6 or e7, bishop e3, developing and defending. Once again, queen takes c3 leads to an advantage for white after king f2. White's pieces are just too active, and the pawn structure is fine for white there. So the main move is castles kingside. Notably, not what my opponent did with this knight d7 move. It is a good thing, in fact, to castle the king for black, it turns out. That's why my opponent sort of lost in the first game, didn't get castled. But here, Jakovenko knows what he's doing and castles the king. Once again, though, this move, queen b3, is the right idea for white. So you can sort of see how even when my opponent deviated a little bit, these theoretical moves, the moves that we're learning here today, are still going to be the guiding factor. So queen b3. And now rather than go with a simple move like knight d7, we saw that this is sort of an empty threat because white has this queen b4 idea, forking queen and knight. So the slightly paradoxical looking queen c7 is actually the right idea for black in this case. Why queen c7? Well, now you can in fact make a legitimate threat to capture this pawn on c5. Also queen b4 on its own may have been a useful tempo to gain at some point later in life for black. Now there are a couple reasonable moves for white, but the move I am going to recommend here, and I did do some digging into all of these, is bishop b5. And I think, from what I could tell, if white plays very, very well, then I think black may not be fully equalizing here. It's possible that, you know, in some of these lines, if both players play perfectly, black is equalizing. It feels like black should be equalizing because this is some of the mainline theory. But in every line that I was looking at, I was just finding small advantages at the very least for whites, or just some tricky positions for black that you have to play near perfectly to survive. So why bishop b5? Why not bishop c4? Why not bishop d3? Why not bishop e2? Well, bishop e2 is obvious. You want to bring the knight here. Why not bishop d3? Well, the bishop actually just doesn't do anything on this square, right? It's looking at this e4 pawn, not the most useful piece in the world, and it also might be a target after a move like rook d8. Why not bishop c4? Well, it turns out one of black's main ideas is to bring this knight to a5 and start attacking these light squares. It'd be a little bit awkward for white to have the queen on b3 and the bishop on c4. A little bit susceptible to some forks, so we get bishop b5, right? And this move has another purpose as well. White is sometimes looking to actually trade off this bishop for one of these knights. Why is that? Well, these knights are the way, the path for black to recapturing on c5. And that's going to be a little bit more difficult if one of them is missing. Also, these knights may create some very tangible threats of attacking these light squares for white. So sometimes it is, again, just useful for white to get rid of this bishop for the knight to help preserve this extra pawn. Here in our main game, we are going to look at the move knight e to c6. Now this position after bishop b5 has been reached over 100 times, and knight e to c6 is played in almost every game. It's played 92 out of 118, I think, by the math I'm using. But I wanted to give a brief honorable mention to e5. So e5 is a sort of tricky move for black that we're going to take a look at. Why are we going to take a look at it? Because if you were watching the 2020 US Championship very closely, you would recognize this position from a game between Sam Shankland with the white pieces and Wesley So with black. And how that game continued was knight e2, bishop e6, c4. This knight came to c6, knight c3, knight a5, queen b4. This knight comes out to e6, and all of a sudden, you start to see this light squared pressure that I was talking about. And it turns out Wesley was quite frankly outplaying Sam in this particular opening. Wesley was taking over these light squares, and Sam was really, really relying on a knight d5 move to help save the day. But with active play, Wesley just made sure Sam never got it. How did he do that? Well, after bishop takes c6, the unfortunate knight takes c4 came. And now the light squares were falling to Wesley So in this game in the US Championship. So this is a horror story. If you saw this game, that you probably never want to play the F3 Nimzo because Sam just got demolished in this game. There was a little bit of back and forth, but Sam was just losing out of the opening. And this is the risk you run in this particular variation. If you allow the opponent's bishop to come out to e6, you allow this knight to a5, then odds are you might be getting busted. Why is that? Well, you've got some looseness around your king, and black's pieces are going to be very, very well placed with this control over the light squares. You just can't give up this much control of your own position. So how do you prevent it? Well, the trick is to do what Anand does in these positions. So let's take a look at how Anand treated this position in a slightly different move order. So Wesley tried this move e5 first and foremost, but let's see how it continues in the main line. Knight ec6 first, knight e2, natural development. E5 here is what was played in our main game. Kingside castles, bishop, or knight a5, queen b4. And now, seemingly, bishop e6 is achieving something very, very, very similar to what Wesley So was getting against Sam Shankland, right? We have the bishop on e6, we have the knight on a5, and if we play something like c4, it is actually true, we would be getting something much like what Sam Shankland got. In fact, this may just be an almost identical position. Somehow, though, I think white is even down an extra tempo here. So, what's the trick? Why would Anand allow this position? What do you think, chat? What should white play in this position? What can be done here? We looked at this game on Twitch when I did a recap of the US Championship, but it is very, very relevant to this opening theory lecture as well. So, what can white do? What's to be done? Well, white should play rook a b1. Yeah, moves like rook a b1, you know, maybe they don't lose off the bat. Maybe white is doing okay, but white can get a very, very solid advantage by playing like Vishy Anand with the incredible sacrifice knight d4. This is the way to regain these light squares against bishop e6 and knight a5. Now, in my opinion, if black is just getting the bishop to e6 and the knight to a5 and invading on these light squares, white is going to be worse. So this should sort of be priority number one in your head if you're playing against this opening or this type of setup from black. If you allow black everything that they want here with these light squares, then you are in serious, serious danger of being worse. If you play something nonchalant like rook a b1, I don't think you're really losing the game. This knight's going to come to a6. You should probably take this piece, queen a4, but you know, you start looking at things like knight c4, and you start asking yourself, what am I doing here? Why am I playing this opening, right? So always, always, always have this bishop e6 idea in mind and have something ready for it. Now, let's take a look at this knight d4 idea. Luckily, I don't think you need to have the deepest theoretical knowledge, you know, memorized moves for this. Just as long as you understand knight d4 is an idea and why it's an idea, then that should usually be enough here. What is the idea? Well, in Vishy Anand against Wang Hao, we saw e takes d4, c takes d4, and white is simply you know, crashing through the center with too many pawns. Just too many pawns. Too many pawns to count. In that game, we saw knight bc6, the simple queen c3. You don't really need to rush things with white here. Knight e7 was the choice for black. Now rook f to d1. White just supports these pawns from behind, and you really don't feel the extra piece for black, right? These knights are totally discombobulated. This bishop is going to be useless after pawn d5. Notably, by the way, white did not play d5 here. Why is that? Well, black's really only equalizing try is to sacrifice a piece back. And Vishy's not even giving him that. He's saying, you know, you will not take two pawns for a piece. I will keep my pawns, thank you very much. Rook a8, bishop f2, a6, and now bishop g3, and the game just went very far south very quickly. With black sacrificing back some pieces there and ending up the exchange with one fewer pawn to worry about. But this was a very good advantage for white, and Anand did go on to win back in 2011 at Tata Steel. Just to show you some moves, this is what happened. This d pawn was the story of the game, along with this a pawn. And here, Wang Hao simply resigned. So, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew this idea of knight d4. This is a great way to fight against this bishop e6 plan for black, right? Keep this one in mind, because if you do allow bishop e6, knight a5, you are in serious, serious danger of being worse. With that in mind, bishop e6 is not the most common move here. Why is that? Well, knight d4 is simply better for white. as Vichy and An demonstrated, and as players have come to learn at the top level. So rather than bishop e6, everybody and their grandmother is playing knight a6 here these days. What's the point? The point is you attack two pieces at the same time. Terrifying. So what should white do in this position? Well, it is time to give up this bishop for one of those knights with bishop takes a6. Now b takes a6, only move. And in the game, I think Chao was doing a really good job of keeping up the pressure here. So what is this position, right? Well, we have very much the same dynamic we had last time. Black truly did make, sort of concession by doubling the pawns here, but what's black's idea? Well, it's the exact same idea we were looking at before. Bishop e6 and knight c4. And even here, after b takes e6, if you're allowing this knight into c4, into b3, into these squares, white's gonna be worse. You can't let them do it. You can't let them do this to you, okay? Just don't let them. So Chao has the right idea here to stop bishop e6, knight c4 at all costs, and he goes rook a to d1. How does this stop bishop e6? Well, again, we don't see knight d4 in this case. With knight d4, unfortunately, I think ignoring it may be the best idea for black, and they would still be getting these light squares. Notably, in the previous position, we had a bishop on b5 preventing this. But rook d5, again, cutting off these light squares, sacrificing material in order to get very mobile, very fluid pawns. And I think this does, in fact, still grant white an advantage. In the game, we saw rook f to b8, queen a4, bishop takes d5 finally, e takes d5, and now rook b5 is the only move for black to try to defend. And then I think Chao actually let Jakovenko off the hook a little bit here with a slightly nonchalant rook d1. The game very quickly fizzled out, rook c5, sacrificing the material back, bishop takes, queen takes, and after some moves, the game was agreed a draw. Nothing too crazy. Okay, maybe this game was a little crazier than I gave it credit for, but not the kind of crazy we're looking for, right? Why are we allowing black to threaten checkmate? So I don't actually like how Chao handled this position with rook d1 here. So white, in my opinion, has a much stronger idea available, and that idea is to go not rook d1, but rather d6. Now, what does d6 do? Well, it attacks the queen, right? Queen c6 now is the only move for black. And now if we go c4, essentially forcing rook takes c5, we actually have a better move here than bishop takes c5. And it's a move that should be familiar to you guys in the chat room. So, what did we do last time black took our c5 pawn? Yeah, that's right. We forked him with queen b4, and the exact same idea is actually just very, very good here for white. Knight b7 actually loses the game to rook b1 with a threat to the knight. If you go rook b8, there's a pin on the b file. So the only move here for black to keep the game going is rook takes c4. And now rather than winning an exchange back, we actually win a full piece. And after queen takes d6, I very much think it's white who's going to be putting on the pressure in this endgame. You have two pieces for a rook and technically two pawns, but one of those pawns is here on a6. And the other one is not super threatening here on e5 either. And I think it's very much white for choice in this endgame, although black should have very strong holding chances. But I think this is the best that black can get in these positions here. So we went pretty deep. We're on move 24 at this point. But the point I'm trying to get at is always, always, always be looking to prevent bishop e6 and a knight to these light squares. This is the main idea in this most popular line against the f3 Nimzo in the knight takes c5 variation, that is. And you just have to stop it. You just have to stop knight c4. But the good news is you have all these various tactical resources, sort of at hand, right? You should be comfortable sacrificing a little bit of material in order to get some mobile pawns. And then if you play well, odds are you're going to have a little bit of an edge in those positions. So how did we get here? Let's recap. e4. Knight f6 is a move which we're going to talk about next, but we focused on knight e7 first. Bishop e3, castles, queen b3, queen c7, sort of the only moves here. then I'm recommending this move, bishop b5, challenging these knights a little bit more directly. Now, everybody plays knight e to c6, but we took a quick look at e5, and that was played against Sam Shankland by Wesley So. And here, knight e2, e5 now, trying to get bishop e6 with knight a5, castles, knight a5, queen b4, now knight a6, bishop a6, ba6, and the key idea by Li Chao to stop knight c4 is rook e1, rook d5, and this turns out to give white a little bit of a pleasant edge. Okay. So, by the way, if knight a5 here, queen b4, knight or e5, castles, this is just an alternate move order to get to the same position. Just figured I should highlight that because e5 played in the game is not the most common. Usually they start with knight a5, but this doesn't really change anything. So, with all this in mind, let's try and improve for Sam Shankland, right? This is the position that Sam Shankland was facing. Wesley did some slight move order trickery to get this bishop out to e6 a little bit more quickly, and Sam, as you might remember, responded with this move c4. And this move got him in quite a bit of trouble. So chat, keeping in mind all of these ideas we looked at in the Li Chao Jakovenko game, what's an improvement for Sam Shankland here? How can you improve on Sam's move? What do you think? What do you think, chat? Yeah, and Chess King has it right. I think the simple queen a4 would have been a massive, massive improvement for Sam Shankland. Why is that? Well, if black is trying the main idea of knight e to c6 and knight a5, once again, he's running into the idea of knight d4, when white is going to be better, right? Just setting up for this knight d4 idea is very, very good for white in this case. And if Wesley tries the simpler approach of just coming after the pawn, now we can, in fact, give up this piece and go something like queen c2. And the fact of the matter is, I don't see how black is actually going to regain this pawn on c5 anymore. And this, I think, would be close to balance. But, okay, what's the point? Well, the point is, in this 97 variation, the really main idea for black is to go e5, bishop e6, and knight a5. And white is supposed to prevent this at all costs, basically, with these knight d4, with these rook d5 ideas, and just start taking over the position from there. All right, questions on this knight e7 move before we move on to knight f6. Time is short, so I must go quickly. All right, moving right along. Bishop c4 should be okay, says Pipinchuk, and yeah, that's true as well. In Sam Shankland's game, after bishop e6, after bishop e6 here, bishop c4 is also fine, but I think the most consistent move with what we've been looking at is queen a4, right? You just keep the position locked and you still maintain this idea of knight d4. But okay, let us move along. Up next, I'm going to show you a game between Sergey Volkov and Gheorghiu Timoshenko. And Sergey Volkov is going to be a name that you're going to be familiar with if you start looking at games in the F3 Nimzo. All this guy does is play games in the F3 Nimzo. Like, I don't know if somehow I'm modeling my repertoire after Sergey Volkov, but like every opening I want to play, I like go deep into the lines and I'm looking at games by this guy. So somehow, some way, Volkov is gonna find his way into your life if you keep playing the F3 Nimzo. But this was a very nicely played game by him that I wanted to take a look at. So let's see what's going on. We have again the starting variation. Takes, c5, very important, not castles. C takes d5, knight takes d5, d takes c5, queen a5, and again e4. And now rather than knight e7, black goes knight f6 in this case. And this move is very, very similar to knight e7, but there are some really key differences. Again, bishop e3 is the move for white. We see kingside castles. And now I sort of dug into all of the various options for white in this case. Right, the main move is still this very natural queen b3, but after knight f to d7, you go down this sort of long and arduous line where, at the end of the day, this is just all theory, by the way, just all theory. Queen a5 takes something like knight c6, and then you choose rook a2 over rook a1 for some reason, and then there's knight e5, and then like f4, and then you do this, and d2 is better than c1 for some reason, and then this, and then this, and then... It's boring. It's so boring. I fell asleep trying to prep this lecture. So I am not going to be recommending the main line in this case, because I think, honestly, this is one of those cases where black is not worse. If black knows all of this, if black is well prepared, then black is just not going to be worse if they're playing this line against the f3 Nimzo. And that's the truth of any opening in chess, really. If black knows what they're doing, you're not going to get an advantage. But what you can do is play something a little bit more offbeat and make that road to equality a little bit less clear to find. So if you're a big theory monger, you might consider playing the move king f2 here rather than queen b3. But that line was still a little bit too theoretical for me, and it feels almost as if white is taking just as many risks as black there. So I'm going to recommend the move that Sergey Volkov played in this case, which is the almost non-existent knight h3. Now, what's wrong with knight h3? Well, nothing really is that wrong with knight h3, to be honest with you. And actually, sorry, I should say, in the game, Volkov played knight h3 first, which I don't totally recommend because queen takes c3 might actually be good here. So I am recommending the main move, queen b3, but then after the only real response, knight fd7, here I'm recommending knight h3, which they transpose to in the game via the other move order. But yeah, I say go queen b3 first. I don't see a real reason to let black take on c3, so just go queen b3. All right, and then knight h3, and now we are in this offbeat variation that I think is a good try for white to play for an advantage. Now, this isn't totally unknown. There are something like 17 games here after knight h3. It's a perfectly normal developing move, so of course it's been tried. But the point is, you're avoiding this stupid theory where you push your a pawn all the way up the board and then trade the queens, and then just keep going and going and going and going and going, and then black is fine, right? You're avoiding all of that. You're just developing your pieces. The best move for black has been played in all 17 games, which is, again, queen c7. You just step out of this queen b4 idea. And now, Sergey Volkov chooses the most annoying way to play, which I think is sometimes the best way to play if you're going for practical chances, and that is with the move queen c4. It's not too late for white to revert to the old boring stuff with going a4, a5, and like this a6, and some sort of weird pressure on the queen side where you trade queens. Like, it's fine for white, but it's also fine for black, and it looks boring to me. So I like what Sergey did instead. He just goes queen c4 and says, I'm going to defend my pawn, right? And this is a pretty different idea compared to what we were looking at in the previous games. So why are we doing this with white here? Well, there's a really key difference between knight e7 and knight f6 to d7. And that is on d7, you're not really concerned as much with this bishop e6 idea. The knight's just in the way of the bishop, and so this is no longer really the main idea for black. So seemingly almost identical position where black is going after c5 with the knights, but with this knight on d7, white is no longer really concerned with bishop e6 and is going to have to be concerned with some other ideas instead. So what ideas are those? Well, in the game, Timoshenko goes knight e5, very tempting move, challenging the queen on c4. Simply queen b4 by white. Now knight b to c6 is still developing with tempo, but now we see this queen on a slightly more familiar square of a4. I think it's not too late to equalize with black here. If you choose bishop d7, just putting this bishop opposite the queen, white can ignore it for the moment and just develop. But after something like knight a5, knight a c6, honestly, it might be in both players' best interests to just start repeating the position. If you do want to keep the game going, though, you can just head back queen a1, and the game will continue. You can play something like a4, queen a2, and once again, though, the main point is that you do have to be a little bit worried about this move e5. So instead of queen a2, something like bishop b5, and you could get just a very normal looking position with something like this, right? And again, white may have some winning tries thanks to having this extra c pawn still on the board with pressure down the b file. So that's sort of what you're aiming for. If you want to keep the game going, you can retreat the queen along the b file and claim that this is not actually the most ideal setup of black's minor pieces. In the game, though, we see knight d7, which is a sort of understandable mistake by black, right? It seems like a pretty natural move. You go knight d7, try to contest the c pawn, and that's you know, the point of your opening with this knight f6 line. You go knight f6, you go knight d7, you attack the pawn. But here, this actually turns out to give white some advantage. White simply develops bishop b5, the move we've seen before, and now after knight a5, again, Volkov plays the most annoying move, which is just queen b4, defending the pawn. And after knight c6, now with the bishop on b5, it's a little bit of a different case. White is not by any means obliged to repeat and can actually get a pretty significant advantage by once again giving up this bishop. You shouldn't really be afraid to give up this bishop in this opening line. It's all about preserving this extra pawn on c5 and keeping your space. So bishop c6, queen c6 played in the game, and now we just see very natural moves by Sergey. Rook d1, rook to the center, a5 hits the queen, queen d4, why not centralize? e5 again hits the queen, and queen d5. Again, it'd be a huge mistake to allow this change in structure, so queen a4 was played. The simple move castles, and white has a very significant edge in this case, thanks to the extra pawn, and also thanks to the very well-placed centralized pieces. And so somehow, Sergey Volkov is getting an advantage in this game. How did he do it? Not by force. Black could have equalized with this idea of bishop d7. Black could have probably equalized with an earlier knight a6. But the point is, this line keeps the pieces on the board, keeps the play going, and that's why it's my recommendation here. Okay. What does knight h3 even do? Why not knight e2 or bishop d3? Well, knight h3 develops and also doesn't commit this bishop to a square. You would like to have this bishop on b5, and I'll go back to that eventually. But knight e2, of course, would be blocking in the bishop on f1. So that's why knight h3. It avoids all the main theory, it develops a piece, and you get to keep pieces on the board and continue playing chess. Let's quickly see how the game finished. Black played rook a6, white brings the knight back to the center, and just fast forwarding a little bit, none of this play was by any means perfect by these two players, but it's clear to see that white is in the driver's seat with pressure on the d file and the b file and against the queen and against the e pawn, and weird maneuvering, but at the end of the day, white does end up winning this game. How does he do it? I don't know. I didn't watch the rest of the game, to be honest. All I cared about was the opening advantage. Yeah, he does it with an h-pawn. Look at that. Like, h-pawn, super scary. Good enough to win a game. And there you go. H-pawn wins the game. Only took 92 moves, right? So if you want to win in 92 moves, this is the opening for you. But okay, let's back up just a little bit here. So, in the game, Sergey played knight h3 first, but again, the main move is queen b3, and that is the move I recommend, but not with the main line idea of a4. It just simplifies too much. If your opponent is playing knight f6, knight d7, I promise you they have looked at this a4 line. This is the main line, and it's a bit too boring for my taste. So I am recommending knight h3 here, keeping pieces on the board. Why not play bishop b5? Well, I think you can play bishop b5 right away, but knight h3 is fine. You come back to f2, control a lot of these squares, and keep an eye on e4. There was one more thing I wanted to mention in these variations, and that is an idea for black in some cases. So let's back up to something like this idea of queen b3, knight fd7, and let's just say we go for this a4 line, queen a3, b6, and let's say white plays some nonchalant move like bishop e2. So there is one active idea that you very much want to keep an eye on. Of course, in this position, I guess black can just retake the pawn here, But that idea I want you to look out for is the idea of f5. I don't want you guys to be blindsided by this idea. It's something you should keep an eye on, and it's one reason why knight h3 is a pretty reasonable developing move for whites rather than something like knight e2. The point kind of is that after some variations, let's say, something like bishop b5, something like f5. Okay, well, first of all, that's here. So let's say queen b4, something like this, f5. The point now for white is knight f2 is often a very good defensive resource, and knight f4 or g5 can be a very good offensive resource in response to f5. So that's another sort of hidden reason why this knight comes to h3. It gives you a bit more options against this active idea of f5 for black. It's an important idea that I wanted to mention. Why not g4 instead of knight h3? Well, I don't know if okay. G4 is a little silly. G4 is a little silly, right? Just a little silly. You don't need to do this. You don't need to do this. The play is mainly on the queen's side in this case with this extra c pawn. And you're not that worried about f5 that you're going to play g4 here. Just develop your pieces and fight on the queen's side. That is the idea of this variation. So, okay, any questions on this main line stuff of the knight takes d5 line of the Nimzo-Indian? These moves, knight e7 and knight f6, this is like 90% of what you're going to face against knight takes d5. So any questions here? Any questions? All right, if not, I want to move on to the trick line with f5. So who better to look at for the trick line than Mamedyarov against Wang Hao? And this is actually taken from a Blitz game. It was the highest rated game I could really find in this line. And the reason for that is I'm recommending a bit of a sideline here. So even though it's a Blitz game, the players did play very, very well in the opening, and that's what matters. Ignore the result. I think Mamedyarov flagged in a very good position at the end or something, so the result doesn't really matter. What matters is these players brought their opening prep to this Blitz game and performed very, very well here. So what line am I talking about? Well, there is sort of a surprise weapon for black in this position. We see d takes c5, and we've spent all the livelong day talking about queen a5, e4, and then this big queenside battle, right? It's all about black trying to regain this pawn, white trying to keep the extra space, black trying to get bishop e6, white preventing it with tactics, right? That's been the main focus of the lecture so far. But black does have another option. That option is to stop e4 by playing the move f5. And believe it or not, I think, if my memory is serving me correctly, the very first time I played a Grandmaster in a classical time control game over the board, I found myself facing down this f5 move, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I had no clue, zero idea of what was going on. There are many options for white in this case. Knight h3 is the main move, queen c2 is the secondary move, e4 is actually playable with the idea of pawn sacrifice. Of course, takes queen h4 check would be unfortunate, but queen c2 here is a playable idea. But what I'm going to recommend to you is the fourth most popular move, because if your opponent is playing f5, odds are they are getting more games in this position than you are. What do I mean by that? Well, f5, like I said, is very much a surprise weapon. And what I don't like to recommend against surprise weapons like f5 is the main stuff against it. Because what happens in the main stuff? Well, white plays, all the best moves for like 10 moves in a row, and then might be slightly better, might even not in this case, right? But players with the black pieces here, because they're going to get this position more often than you, they're playing it every time against the f3 Nimzo, then they're going to be just more experienced in that main stuff. So I really, really like the move Mamedyarov played in this case, which is c4. And c4 is a very interesting idea for white. At first glance, it looks like a perfectly natural move. You want to remove... It's like down your shirt. Okay, sorry about that. You want to remove this knight from d5, but of course there's a massive downside to this, and that is that it hangs a pawn, right? And so this is in fact actually just a pawn sacrifice by Mamedyarov. And like I said, this is very much not the most common response to this f5 idea for black, and I think that's a really good thing, because you're not going to be getting this very often, and I found that c4 is a move you can play without actually memorizing too much. The play comes pretty naturally, I think. So queen h4 check, g3 to get out of check, queen takes c4, and the idea is that you do get to play this move e4 with tempo on the queen and tempo on the knight. And if you remember from earlier in the lecture, I said to keep an eye on this idea, bishop d2, queen e5. Here is where it is coming up again, right? The only difference is, in this case, black has a pawn on f5 already. So unlike in the position that I talked about earlier, white is not just close to winning here, because this pawn on f5 makes a very serious difference, right? Pressuring e4. It's kind of funny how it's almost literally identical to the position of queen c3, bishop d2, queen e5, but g3 and f5 have just been inserted. Funny how chess works like that sometimes. So how should we continue? Well, our pawn's attacked. We should defend it with bishop g2, and now fe4, fe4. And it turns out the best line for black goes something like knight c3. When takes is not the best response for white, but you can go queen c1, knight e4, and then not putting anything on the e-file, but actually just removing the queen from being in front of your king with bishop f4. And after queen d4, the best move in the position, the only real move to not give white a significant advantage, bishop e3. Now if queen back to e5, we have time to play knight f3 with our c pawn defended. Right? If we played knight f3 here, then queen c5 was fine for black. But with this inserted, then knight f3 is quite good. White will castle next, and life is very good for the white pieces. Queen d3, however, is a bit better. Knight e2, and then if something like castles, we'll go knight f4. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a position with two bishops for white, and I think a little bit of an edge in this case, a little bit of an edge. How did white end up getting an edge in the surprise f5 weapon with a not popular move? Well, it turns out way back here, this move, queen h4 check, while very seemingly the most natural idea in the position, is not the best idea in the position. I think after queen h4 check, e4, this very forcing line, this is the only line for black to not lose material. The fact of the matter is, I think white is just a little bit better. So what can black do instead? Well, way back here, better for black than queen h4 is exploiting this move of c4 in a slightly different way. How is that? Well, you can exploit the weakness on this diagonal with queen f6. And this is the path to equality for black here. This move, queen f6, is sort of diffusing the c4 idea. However, I kind of doubt that, that your opponents are going to be so well prepared, to be honest. I kind of doubt it. And there's actually another game here that Mamedyarov has played against Ivanchuk, and he actually lost that game too. I didn't do too much research into how that game happened, but the best move here for white is bishop g5. I think in that game, Mamedyarov played bishop d2, which isn't a very good move. But bishop g5 is the nice sacrificial idea for white. You are defending this rook with tempo on the queen. Against anything now, you are going to capture on d5, so queen g5, cd5 is best. Now in the game, e takes d5 was played, and now I'm looking at a game between Alyanov and somebody with a very difficult name to pronounce, named Mikhedlishvili. And in that game, I think white found the best move here. Alyanov with the white pieces didn't actually take on d5, because this pawn is just not a very good pawn for black. And better, I think, for white is to just develop naturally with knight h3. Queen came to e3, now queen d2 is just untangling for white. If you take on c5, look out for rook c1, that would be ending the game. So d4 was played instead. Now rook d1 is still gaining this d pawn with a little bit of extra development. Knight a6 was played, takes, e3, bishop d7, bishop c4. Knight e6 was played in the game, takes, king d2. And this is just equality. Not gonna lie to you and say white is winning by force in this sideline of the f3 Nimzo that nobody ever plays. It's a sideline for a reason, right? c4, black can equalize with this move queen f6, but you know, the road to get there is not exactly trivial, right? There's a lot of places where black can go wrong here, and in particular, the most commonly played move, the most natural move, queen h4 check, the point of f5 in many cases, is, I think, leading to an advantage for white in this line that we talked about, with g3 takes e4, bishop g2, and here, knight c3 being the best move, still doesn't fully equalize thanks to queen c1 and bishop f4. Now in the game, black played the very, very natural kingside castles. However, I think this is even worse for black than knight c3 is. Why is that? Well, white simply just develops their pieces. Knight e2 played in the game. This knight is now actually hanging, so knight f6 was played. And here, white just castled kingside, but I believe the move bishop f4 is close to game ending. Again, you can't take on c5 because of bishop d6 in this case. Queen a5 check is met with the bishop, and white picks up in exchange. And basically what you would get is the game position, except white gets to keep their c-pawn. In the game, Mamedyarov castled, and black is equalizing after queen takes c5. You know, just a pawn for the activity that white is going to get with the bishops, and black is doing fine here. But had white played bishop f4, this is effective enough at defending the c-pawn, and then white can castle, and you essentially get the same position with none of the compensation for black. And white would, I think, be significantly better in this case. So, what do you need to know about this f5 move? Well, you need to remember that this move c4 is a good offbeat option to sort of combat this idea. After queen h4 check, you block, and just play the natural moves. Attack both pieces, block the check, defend your pawn, takes played, develop, this knight moves out of the way, and here, bishop f4 is a nice tactic if you find it. If you don't find it and just castle, it's not like white is worse. Black just has a pawn for your activity, right? So, any questions now on any of these lines in the knight takes d5 Nimzo-Indian? I think I covered pretty much everything that is important. Pippin Truck says, so what about queen d4? You'll have to be more specific. I don't know where you mean. I'm also not sure what Steve North means. These questions